Hi, I'm Dr. Anitra Warrior with Morningstar Counseling, and in this video, we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is often connected to historical trauma, which is based on a collective trauma that's often experienced by a group of marginalized populations. For example, with American Indians, their experience in the boarding school was a defining moment for their culture, for many of the tribes across the country. What had happened was moving children to boarding schools where they did not have relationships with their parents. They were not allowed to speak their language. They experienced tremendous amounts of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and there were never efforts to work on coping skills, to heal from the trauma they had experienced. Upon returning home, the adaptive patterns or the maladaptive patterns were passed to their next generation. For example, with the substance abuse, with physical abuse. These were ways in which they had to heal to survive. And unfortunately, those patterns of behavior are passed from one generation to the next. And this is not just with American Indian populations. This is across the globe with traumatic experiences that populations have experienced throughout our history. What research is finding is for those individuals who have experienced significant levels of trauma and have not had that treated, this is passed down through DNA. What we're finding is that in the expression of our genetics, essentially, people may be more prone to PTSD. They may be more prone to anxiety or depression. So it is important for us to recognize that transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. When we look at the impacts of intergenerational trauma and how that can affect parenting, what we see is that trauma reliving, staying present for the parent and being passed down to the child. So even though the child may not have been born at the time the parent had experienced the trauma, the child is still going to know the effects of that trauma based on the parent's response and how they're raising the child. For example, anger is often referred to as a secondary emotion. What we mean by the secondary emotion is that anger is often masking shame, guilt, embarrassment. It's easier to use anger as a protective emotion rather than feeling vulnerable and allowing people to see that right now I'm hurt. What happens is that anger continues to be shared with our children. This can manifest through physical abuse, through neglect, many ways that anger can be harmful to our children. But that is the protective emotion that some parents have learned to use, and that's passed from one generation to the next. So in using anger in my parenting skills, I'm teaching my child to be angry, and they will then teach their children to be angry. And that almost becomes like a family dynamic that's accepted as the norm, when actually it's not. It's still a response to trauma. When talking about intergenerational trauma and working with families and overcoming this, I often use a personal example of my life. And in that situation, what I share is my experience with a natural disaster in which I lost my oldest child due to a tornado. And in my grief, I had continued to move several times, and I had thought, I think I'm trying to find my place or trying to repair something or trying to find something, but I never allowed myself to settle. I continued to just stay busy. I always had my younger children with me, and I thought, as long as my children were with me, they were okay. I didn't recognize my own healing from the trauma, or lack of healing, I should say. And as my children grew, what we've learned is they remembered every place that we had moved to. And that's had an impact on them as adults. So now this is something that they are having to work through and really being aware of in how they're raising their own children. So we have regular discussions about the moves that we had, why I was moving, the emotional toll that took on them, and that just being in my presence wasn't enough. There was more to it. And those are things that we're having to work through. They can be very difficult conversations to have when we're talking about intergenerational trauma. And it's not a personal attack on parents. It's recognizing that parents were doing their best to survive. That can be really difficult when we start doing our best to break these cycles, is recognizing the hurt that is there, the pain, and having to be vulnerable when it comes to the trauma that was experienced, and knowing that sometimes we don't make the best decisions, but we do what we need to survive. For parents and caregivers who are raising children that have experienced trauma in the past, when we look at intergenerational trauma, what's important for us to recognize is that the experience may have been lived in a different manner. So for example, one child may not have the same reaction to a parenting response that the other child does. So our children are actually going to have their own realities of what they've experienced. So they may not respond in the same way. Some children may be more detached from their parents, while others may be clingy. So please keep that in mind as you're learning more about intergenerational trauma, the responses to trauma, how trauma impacts families, is just knowing that each individual will have their own response to how they're taking care of themselves, what self-preservation may look like for them. In addition to talking with your family members and naming the trauma that has happened and naming and identifying the responses that we have, utilizing family therapy can also be very beneficial. Sometimes it's not always the best time to go right into family therapy, and individual therapy may be the most effective until we have the appropriate coping skills and our team as a family can come together to work through these, have these difficult discussions, but have the skills to be able to move past that. As we recognize the pain that's associated with intergenerational trauma, a few things that I think are really important for us to recognize is that it didn't start with us. There are patterns of behavior that have been passed down from generation to generation, and it's about survival. And that's a strong term to keep in mind and to keep close to your heart as you're working through overcoming these cycles of pain, essentially. So please remember that it didn't start with you, that help is always available, and being able to have these difficult discussions, allowing that vulnerability, is healing for your family now, but also for generations to come. Thank you.